Hi there, my name is Nicole, and for the past couple of months I have been growing tons and tons of tomato plants on a balcony. A tiny balcony, might I add. Before I started this adventure, I did a lot of Googling. Can you grow tomato plants on a balcony? How tall will your tomato plants get? What about pests? Do I need a lot of sunshine? These are all questions that, went through my head before I started my tomato plant adventures. So anyway, with several successful tomato plants of many different species right now, I thought I would just sit down and talk about a few things I did to grow tomatoes on a balcony. Number one, sunlight. So tomato plants need a lot of sun, preferably at least 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. Now, I have a lot of tomato plants. And in the beginning, when they were small, giving all of them direct sunlight was a pretty easy thing to do. Now that they're getting bigger though, I'm not going to be able to provide that sunlight for all of them, so some of them I'm probably going to have to give away. But what I did to maximize the amount of sunlight that my plants are getting is I bought these little hanging baskets where I could put the pots in, and this basically put the tomatoes close to the edge of the balcony where they would get the most amount of direct sunlight every single day. And right now they get direct sunlight between like 9:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m., something like that, which is enough for tomato plants to bear fruit. So if you have a balcony, you want to make sure your balcony gets enough sun, and if you have tomato plants on it, find the best way to put those tomato plants in the sunniest spot. Number two, pot size. The bigger your pot, the bigger your tomato plant is most likely to grow. And I have experimented with many different pot sizes, and I can confirm that the tomato plants that are in the largest pots are actually growing the fastest and the largest. So I have some 2-gallon pots, some 3-gallon pots, even a 5-gallon pot, and the plants are all different sizes, but again, the bigger the pot, the better. You also want to make sure you have 1 tomato plant per pot. But I can't say I have done this perfectly. I have experimented. I wanted to see what happens when you put 2 tomato plants in a pot. And what happened is that the pots that have 2 tomato plants in them are growing a lot slower and staying a lot smaller than the tomato plants that have a pot all for themselves. That's not to say you can't grow tomato plants when there's 2 in a pot, but it is definitely better if you can have 1 pot for 1 tomato plant. But when you have like 15 or I don't know, between 10 and 20 tomato plants like me, there's no way you can have that many pots on a balcony my size. That's why I'm also experimenting. But as long as I have a couple of perfectly formed plants in big pots, like that's all I really need. 3, variety. The next thing you want to ask yourself is, what variety of tomatoes are you growing? For balconies and balcony gardens, cherry tomatoes are actually perfect because they grow well in pots. They, don't get overwhelmingly large, and you can get a lot of cherry tomatoes from just, a few plants. Some of the other species of tomatoes, some of those bigger ones, they grow really big. They may need more space, bigger pots. I do have a variety of species growing, but right now the cherry tomato plants are doing the best. Soil. Next, you want to ask yourself, what type of soil are you using? And you definitely want to be using potting soil, not garden soil. Garden soil is excessively heavy for containers and can contain disease organisms. Potting soil is light and fluffy and will provide space for air and moisture to move through the pot. Next, you'll want to ensure that you water your tomato plants all the time, especially on hot days. But not too much. Finding the perfect amount to water your plants is not always easy. That's why I use one of these moisture meters to kind of measure how wet the soil is. But on really, really hot days where it's 90, 100 degrees, I notice that my tomato plants need to be watered several times a day. And on cooler days, they might not need that much water. So just kind of check on your plants all the time. Next, make sure you give your plants nutrients. I use an organic fertilizer, and I also use crushed eggshells and other organic matter that I add into the soil. And finally, make sure that you support the tomato plants. Either use a stake or a tomato cage or both, because tomato plants are going to grow up. You want to attach them, you want to protect them from damage from storms and wind and all of that. and I learned the hard way. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a pretty big storm here, and one of my tomato plants, the biggest one I had, pretty much like snapped in half. Well, not quite in half, but like a big part of it just, snapped off. And I was really upset because this branch that snapped off had a lot of tomatoes on it. To make matters worse, I was then moving it around, and as I was moving it around, I accidentally broke off another huge branch. So, I was upset. But what I really should have done is fastened those branches to the tomato cage. I did have a cage, but I didn't tie the branches onto it. And if I had done that, the branches would have been protected from the wind that day. So, lesson learned. Take care of your tomato plants. So if these tips were helpful, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel if you're new here, and in a future video, I'm actually going to talk about what I did with that branch that, got snapped off by the storm, because I still have it and it is thriving. So stay tuned for that. Till next time.